Patreon-sponsored review time again, and I've got a request from my roommate Alexis once more, and this time it is a doozy of a series. In the not-too-distant future, adorable hamster Hibiki Tachibana attends a concert of the idol duo Zweiwing, only to be caught up in an attack by the Noise, an alchemically created race of vibrational creatures, who when they make contact with organic life, reduce them to dust. The Zweiwing idols, Kanade Amo and Tsubasa Kazunari, are secretly magical girls trained to battle these resident creatures with the power of music. But unfortunately, the enemy forces are too strong for them, resulting in Kanade using a suicide attack built into their powers to take them all out, at the cost of her own life. While Hibiki is gravely injured as consequence, she is ultimately left the sole survivor of the massacre. Flash forward 2 years, and amidst another attack by the Noise, Hibiki awakens within her the power of a fragment of Kanade's powers that was left within her during the previous attack, sourced from the mythical Norse relic Gungnir, that permits her to fight back against these creatures, before subsequently recruited by the Kazunari clan faction of Japan's government to be trained to become a protector of the world. Aided in battle by the traumatized literal swordwoman Tsubasa, who struggles to overcome the loss of her lover Kanade, and coming into conflict with other girls bearing the same powers before Hibiki's openness towards them slowly turns them to their side. The gun-toting Chris Yukine, the black spear and later silver blade Maria Cadenza Eve, the slashing scythe girl Kirika Akatsuki, and cutting chainsaw-toting Shirabe Tsukiyomi, while being supported on the sidelines by government agents led by Tsubasa's uncle Genjiro, as well as Hibiki's canon waifu Miku Kohinata. These girls form the Symphogear, and over the course of 65 episodes divided into 5 seasons, fight the Noise, alchemists wielding heretical supernatural artifacts, and magical gods, with a spring in their step and a song in their heart. All the while the gear they wield act as double-edged blades, which always bear the risk of harming their wielders. For that shard of Gungnir that was left in Hibiki's body, it's slowly killing her, as battle by battle her use of its powers is leading it to eat her alive. As for those in the know, Symphogear is suffering, and I mean on a level I've not actually seen done with Magical Girl series in this same way. While I am not a connoisseur of Magical Girl series, as they're legitimately just not for me 90% of the time, from the ones I have watched, Symphogear has an entirely unique feel to it. But again, I'm not a frequent viewer of them, so I could be entirely wrong on that. And the most obvious one to draw the similarity shouldn't need much stating, that series being Puella Magi Madoka Magica. And that's for a simple reason. Both series protagonists, Hibiki Tachibana and Madoka Kaname, share the same voice actress between them, the incredibly talented Aoi Yuki, who has exploded onto the voice acting map in the 2010s and 2020s with how ubiquitous she's become. And it's not just from voicing standout characters like Froppy in My Hero Academia. She's also Kumoko in So I'm a Spider, So What, and Best Girl Futaba Sakura in Persona 5. She spent Pokemon's 5th generation voicing the anime incarnation of gym leader Iris, and was also Styx in the Japanese dub of Sonic Boom. She's pretty much been everywhere, even in tokusatsu series like Kamen Rider Ghost, where she voiced the Ghost Cat mascot for the show Yurusen. Though her showing up in a Toku show or Toku-adjacent material is kind of funny, as it just keeps happening. Hell, it's actually because of a Toku show that she got started in her career. Not just because she's young Mari Sonata in Kamen Rider Faiz either. Oh no, it goes back farther. And I've got footage of it.
こいつの命はないぜ。兄さん。人質はお前のお得意だな。今の私に人質など意味は。貴様らバルバンを倒すのに。だな。やってみろ。だが同時に貴様の命もない。
Yeah, I actually laughed when I realized who that was the first time, which was made even funnier by the Symphogear mobile game that's done crossover events with Henshin hero properties. But yeah, Symphogear ends up having a great deal of story compare-contrast thanks to the actor illusions made possible by its cast, and they're largely to the show's benefit, as with exception to the character Maria actually playing into her voice actress's typecasting, most of the lead girls have their roles here being distinct from the rest of their careers, which has made an appealing impact on them and the viewers. So let's get the Madoka Magica similarity out of the way first, as it's the easiest to address. That series is from start to finish formatted as a tragedy, a girl futilely using time travel to try and save the girl she loves from a damned fate of oblivion, and ending up failing so hard in the end that said girl she loves ends up erased from existence as the paradox of the time loops gives her so much potential magical power, she ascends to a godhood that breaks the need for other magical girls to suffer. It's a series that explores futility through apotheosis and the selflessness of the title character to the point her own well-being and role in the world becomes disregarded. And in its movies, how the actual main protagonist of the story, Homura Akemi, can't accept a world where the magical girls in it don't have to suffer if the person she loves can't be part of it, so ends up descending to become a devil to free that love from the shackles imposed upon both of them. In this way, the story is haunting and beautiful, but it is still deeply flawed because every wound they experience is ultimately self-inflicted due to the cast's shown inability to change, and their ultimate stagnation within these varying cycles. This has ultimately, over time, come to be my central criticism of the works of Madoka Magica's head writer, Gen Urobuchi, that he may possess amazing plot progression in his works with how his stories develop and lay themselves out, but he is consequently terrible at actually showing character progression for those part of his casts, as the stories he writes always end up having the characters damn themselves by being unable, unwilling, or incapable of changing despite the hardships they suffer, encouraging them to change and grow to survive them. And thus they tend to break under the forces they suffer. This is primarily because the series Gen Urobuchi has most been influenced by in his writing is the series Ryuki, where the cast don't have character development. Hell, they have negative character development, as they don't learn a damn thing from what they go through. Literally every series that is anyway like Ryuki is better than Ryuki for a reason. But damn, do we just still get a lot of unwatchable crap when people try to blindly ape that series without understanding its failures. But this is where Symphogear lies in that sphere of contrast, as while main girl Hibiki in this series is comparable to her prior actor role as Madoka, the show doesn't break the cast through its struggles. It harms them, but because the series remembers that the cast are supposed to be representative of living people, it makes it so those injuries don't shatter them like glass, but their struggles are scars marring skin that with time, support, and care can be made to heal. And through healing, that wound can be made immaculate again, or the tissue that was broken before can grow back stronger. This is in turn what Symphogear does with its cast. Its storyline drives their problems to the surface in such a way that it forces them to confront, resolve, and move beyond them, as opposed to being crushed or shattered under the weight and force of them. And that honestly makes it a better show due to it being allowed to progress in such a way that it makes the cast legitimately earn their happy ending through their blood, sweat, and tears. And there is a lot about Symphogear that showcases this throughout its various aspects, storylines, and character dynamics. There's actually so much here, it's beyond the scope of a Patreon request. As despite Alexis asking me to only really cover the first season, we marathoned through all 65 episodes of the show over the last year, so I'd have context to the full run of the series. The first 2 seasons of which, as I record this, Symphogear and Symphogear G, having been released by Discotech Media. With the final 3 seasons, GX, AXZ, and XV, having recently been announced as having been licensed and soon coming to Blu-ray as well from Discotech. And I'm telling you right now, buy those versions. They are the legitimate best version of the content you will find, with superior translations than what either the fan subs or Crunchyroll did for the series, and included all the bonus material and canon OVA content for the series they possibly could. This is S-tier quality anime releases right here, which is where we should probably discuss the first, issue surrounding the show. In that, there are a lot of bad translations for it, and they pretty much start with Crunchyroll screwing up with it. And the way Crunchyroll botched things with Symphogear is rather easy to explain. They didn't originally translate the songs when they got the seasons, and thus everyone else had to. Symphogear, as you can tell by the musical allusions I've been making and even the series name, is an outright musical. Each of the girls' armed gears responds to and grows stronger when the girls sing amidst their battles, and the power of music transcending the differences and misunderstandings of people being part of the series' core themes about communication. While one might think that such is a distraction or falls under the category of people fighting shouldn't be talking in a fight scene, that's a distraction from what they're doing. Well, this is one of the rare examples where there is a legitimate subversion of that problem trope, as what happens in the midst of battle or from story events actually can affect the pace, tempo, and performance of each song featured, to show the proper integration of such into the series. I have previously said in regards to musicals that I generally don't like them because of how the musical elements are integrated into such being intrusive. They are often done in such a way that it removes aspects of the narrative story by taking the audience out of the active events to have the musical number occur, such often acting as a non sequitur to everything else to have that happen. And when the musical number is a non sequitur, it is ultimately worthless with regards to the story it is part of. This central criticism I have of musicals does not happen in Symphogear. Well, okay, there is the beef stroganoff scene, but that is the exception that proves the rule. Every other time, the music is actually integrated into the narrative of what is going on. And thus, this is how it makes this element of the series work, as it never forgets what is happening alongside the musical number. This integration done in this way, I have never seen done before, and this is always what I wanted musicals to do. Each of the gears functions by releasing more power and strength the more their users synchronize with the gear. And in order for the gears to do so, they must release their power in the form of harmonic resonance, referred to in series as the term phonic gain, which is tied to the cast's own feelings and character. Thus, as they grow as people, their personal internal melody changes and increases their ability to synchronize with the gear and grow alongside the power, and eventually access stronger and stronger capabilities more easily as the series goes on. As is revealed, only 2 cast members are naturally harmonious with their respective gears, but that in turn is shown to in part be due to their upbringing and trauma that aligns themselves with traits of their artifacts. Half the other users must be injected with a special drug that artificially raises their synchronization rate with their gears, which proves itself to be heavily toxic and lethally harmful to their bodies if used over an extended period. Or in Hibiki's case, the implantation of Gungnir into her body allows for artificial harmonization with it. Thus, each of the songs they sing, which empowers them throughout the series, end up as much part of the exploration and evolution of their characters over the course of the series narrative, and the actual main story content the series features the rest of the time.
シンフォギアってカラオケ装置なんだよね。シンフォギアから伴奏が流れると胸に歌詞が湧き上がってくるんだ。
歌詞もまた奏者が心象に描く風景に由来としたものだと。
さっきそんなのぶっ込まれたところでなんで押されてんだ。無垢にして苛烈。
Yeah, that's the moment in one of the OVAs are canon by the way, where Miku comes to the conscious realization that she is in love with Hibiki, which affects her actions for the rest of the series. And them coming to terms with their love for one another, as well as openly convey and communicate that, is one of the major narrative themes and storylines of the full series. And the way Crunchyroll botched this, besides also not getting those canon OVAs, really isn't how they didn't translate the songs. At least not at first, as sometimes they had them, but they definitely were not done well. So a major portion of the narrative story and its plot progression was being lost by watching the show on their platform. And a lot of the time, when the story would deliberately call back to previous events or narrative details, or make really clever allusions that expanded view upon those themes, yeah, it was obvious in those moments the translators were not paying attention, as a lot of them were also botched entirely. And unfortunately, that set off an entire fan-sub translation war with regards to the show, with arguments on what was the right way to translate all the minute details of it on a scale I've never seen, and with complete and utter misunderstanding of how translation works that lasts to this very day. And frankly, the arguments in this fandom over those fan translations are quite bad, with how apparent it is that many don't know how translation even works. As well they do provide the songs, a lot of them are just as, if not more wrong about the details than the Crunchyroll version was. Like, I give fan translators who translated series in an era where they couldn't get transcripts a lot of slack for their screw-ups, as it's clear they couldn't do better with the resources available when they did them at that time. But that's not as justifiable now to keep repeating such errors. If you're making the same errors that a group in 2002 did now, when you can get transcripts of those series captions to work with, you really have no excuses. Granted, I came into this after the fact, so some of this information is secondhand, but what I just presented is what is apparent in the here and now on the matter. But this also draws attention to something that has been bothering me about anime releases for quite some time now. As with anime that simulcasts, when it comes time for the home release, they just stick with the simulcast script on the Blu-rays with no updates or changes if something was wrong. So if they didn't do the signs and songs the first time, then they're still not on the goddamn Blu-rays. Funimation and Crunchyroll, now one company, it's coincidentally, have been ridiculously bad about this for years now. And Mill Creek fell into that same trap with many of their Ultraman Blu-rays as well, to say nothing of the crap Shout Factory still pulls with their screw-ups. And that doesn't endear me to continuing to pick up their releases as a result, as it's a showcased half-assed effort which is inexcusable. But then by contrast, you look at the stuff released by Sentai Filmworks, signs and songs included, and quality rechecks on their subtitles, hell, even some of the dubs, if a show has been streamed. Media Blaster's recent comeback, same thing. And if you look at what Discotek does, they're the literal grandmasters at this. And you don't need to look further than their release of Bobo's anime as an example, where they wrote and included 40,109 English subtitles that the previous licensor of the series said was impossible to include due to the time and effort it would take to properly do that job. But they did it anyways, and they got my money for putting in the effort to do right by it. And that's not even touching the extra mile they regularly go to for their other releases to make sure they get as much as they can right. So Discotek getting the license for Symphogear's home releases and doing a ground-up retranslation of the subtitles, they are literally no better hands for the property to be in. Granted, them releasing it was also a boon to the anime production company behind the series, Satellite Incorporated. Satellite has a very impressive library of anime they've put out over the years, but have gotten stymied on attention to them. They're known for Macross Frontier and Delta, which were blocked from import by the continuing mess with Harmony Gold over the Macross rights, but are also known for Genesis of Aquarion and the first 175 episodes of Fairy Tales anime. But thanks to their more recent partnering with Discotek, and the success the Symphogear Blu-rays have had, well, they've finally secured a win-win pipeline for their stuff properly getting out. And it's probably best they started with Symphogear 2, as its make had some major talent behind it that helped make it a hit to begin with. Symphogear's main director was the one I was more familiar with of the two, however, said director being Katsumi Ono, the man who was also the director for the grand majority of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, the best Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime of them all. And that shows itself in Symphogear. Seriously, his directorial style is all over this series. But on the writing side, well, all 65 episodes were written by Akifumi Kaneko, who is best known as the lead designer and scenario writer of the Wild Arms game series before this. And I have never played a Wild Arms game. It's been on my list. Though the weird thing about Kaneko writing all the episodes of Symphogear is, well, something happens at the end of the series with the XV season, where there's just this odd quality drop which rubs people the wrong way. And there's been no single answer as to why that season of the 5 ends up, well, just fighting itself. But regardless of that, Ono's direction, alongside Kaneko's strips and the songwriting of the show's head composer Noriyasu Akamatsu, who also did the music for the Wild Arms games, it made the series what it was alongside the talent of the voice cast.
ついに出ちゃいましたね。地獄からテヘペロちゃん。あったんですよ。いやでもまさかね、歌詞に使われるとは思わなかったですよね。自分の曲でもないけど。いやでもマルシー取ってたらさ、あげまつさんからお金取れたよね。
And that talent is the rather surprising thing about this, as half the cast are not regular singers, and yet with how things are performed in the show, you'd never realize it. The only true professional idol among them was Tsubasa's voice actress, the ever-talented Nana Mizuki, who despite spending the most time on her long-lasting singing career, has somehow managed to maintain a consistent presence as a voice actress in roles such as Fate Testarossa in Lyrical Nanoha, Mocha Akashiya in Rosaria Vampire, and Angelise Misurugi in Cross Age, Rondo of Angels and Dragons. Hell, the theme song for Nanoha that she performed, Eternal Blaze, it's considered by many to be her best song, despite many of the Symphogear songs she's sung, including all 5 seasons' opening themes, are considered rivals to it. But that isn't to say she was the only one among the cast with musical talent. As with ironic exception to Aoi Yuki, the rest of the cast have some history performing songs for anime or releasing music singles alongside their regular voice roles. Aoi Yuki has done songs for anime after being part of Symphogear, as it expanded her capabilities into that field, but that wasn't an inherent trait beforehand. Yoko Hikasa, who plays Maria Cadenza Eve, has performed songs for many of the series she's been a part of, ranging from the series K-On! Where she voices Mio Akiyama, Attack on Titan where she's Frida Reese, A Certain Magical Index's film Miracle of Endymion, where she portrays Shutara Sequencia, and of all places High School DD, where she's actually most known for portraying Rias Gremory.
Tell me something. Tell me who's the loneliest.
Miku's voice actress Yuka Iguchi has been part of many of the same projects as Yoko has been, and them both being the female main cast members of the mecha anime Majestic Prince. But Yuka is more known for her role as Index Laborum Prohibitorum in A Certain Magical Index, where she's also done a few of their opening and end themes. Chris Yukine's voice actress Ayahi Takagaki was not known for being a singer before this series, despite her being part of the musical group Sphere since 2009. The most she had been known for before her role here was as Felt Grace in Gundam 00, and yet for many, her work on Symphogear served to be her breakout role in getting her voice out there as both an actor and a singer. Yoshino Nanjo, who voices Shirabe Tsukiyomi, was from 2009 to 2021 a member of the idol group Fripside, who, to correlate a common connection between the actresses, then performed a majority of the opening themes to A Certain Magical Index's companion series, A Certain Scientific Railgun, where Yoshino likewise has a recurring role as Maya Awatsuki. But she has also voiced Reka Tatsunaji in Cardfight Vanguard, the Little Queen in Tales of Grace's F, Creel Mayor Baldison in Final Fantasy XIV, and Kiria Kurono in the Fire Emblem series. And lastly, Kirika Akatsuki's actress, Ai Kayano, most will likely know as La Latina Darkness for Dustiness from Konosuba.
あのデュラハンの兜の下のいやらしい目をあれは私をこのまま城へと連れ帰り
Toshiro in No Game No Life, and once more is a common name to the Index and Railgun series with her role as the magician Itsuwa, and has performed opening and end themes for both No Game No Life and Konosuba, as well as Guilty Crown and Saikano. Though many of these actresses end up having other common series where they cross paths, it shows the dedication to casting actresses that had clear capabilities both in selling the roles they played and being able to perform the songs they needed to, which is a large portion to why it is very likely the series will never be dubbed, as doing right by the music element is integral to the success of the show, and a lot of English voice actresses are just not good singers, like, at all. There's been interviews about how Aoi and Ayahi, the less experienced singers of the ensemble, were pushed hard to build out their talent in that specialty, and it does show, as they do successfully keep pace with everyone. Hell, for many, Ayahi's songs as Chris are among their favorites of the series' extensive discography. And Aoi especially has spoken at length about how nervous she was to be paired up with Nana Mizuki for much of the first season, and felt like she wouldn't be able to hold her own against the much more talented and experienced actors and singers in the cast. Because you have to remember, at the same time Nana Mizuki was breaking out like mad in the music industry with her 2001 album Supersonic Girl, well, in that same year, Aoi Yuki was 9. She very likely grew up listening to Nana's songs on the air and in the anime she watched, which, when put in context to Hibiki and Tsubasa's characters, actually explains and expands upon a lot of what the first season does and has between them regarding their status as senior and junior, and the plot's central drive for Hibiki to improve herself to not lag behind and be a hindrance to Tsubasa. Because that was what the actors themselves were experiencing.
翼さんの歌に励まされたからです。聞く人に元気をくれる歌だってこと、私は知っています。
立花。
私はもうスタッフさんも絶対私をキャスティングして失敗したと思ったと思って、で2期の時は2期まで続いちゃって絶対失敗したと思ったって思われて、3期まで続いちゃって、もうこれもう切れないやつだ私のことって思ったけど、4期まで来たらさすがに開き直って私でよかったんだってなってる。
For with Kanako's writing, there's a crossing of some lines between where the actresses end and the characters begin.
エクシブということで。エクシブ。いやでもこれ言ったら金子さん反映させちゃうかもしれないですよ。ちょっと待ってセリフにね。そうさりげなく入ってくるよ。そうラジオで言ったポンポンスーもまさかのセリフに入ってましたかね。
エクシブ。この寒さプチ氷河期どころじゃないぞ。
Though really, the entire show ends up becoming something of a 6 degrees of separation in regards to the voice talent it uses. You can pretty much play spot the voice actor with this show and get even more enjoyment out of it. But like I said before, Alexis asked me to only really cover Symphogear Season 1 in this, and we're already running long with regards to doing so, so to actually focus on the plot of the series once more, Symphogear Season 1 has its central focus on Hibiki, after awakening Gungear's powers within her, actually learning how to use her newfound abilities. Oh yes, this is not a Henshin Hero series where the powers come with a manual. It takes dedicated training to be up to snuff physically and mentally to be able to fight properly, which she eventually takes like a duck to water, even as she's thrown into the deep end of the ongoing conflict. And not help that despite 2 years having passed, Tsubasa herself has not gotten over Kanade's death. So Hibiki wearing her lover's gear is something she herself struggles to get over, thus isn't the best senior to help her getting accustomed to the capabilities she now bears. For while the Symphogears are magic, well, pretty much any fan of the series will tell you, their capabilities more show themselves to be based upon stylized technology, as if bonding with the magic relics they do more turn the girls into battle androids with their capacity to alter the gear and their weapons to suit their needs and the theme each of their relics has, with many of the powers and abilities the girls use more defined by their imagination coinciding with that theme. In practice, this makes a lot of them a bit more specialized versions of the builds featured in the cartoon series Generator Rex, and allows the characters to blur the line between whether the girls are actually magical girls in following the Henshin hero tropes, or whether the Symphogear power set is actually a mechanical power armor that just draws power from a magical means. Since the gear was created through alchemy, and alchemy's entire thing is transmutation. Channel one's will and spirit into music, make that music into power, power into tools, tools into armor, and armor into strength. And as is the recurring joke about Symphogear as a result, Symphogear is on the borderline of qualifying as something that could pop into a Super Robot Wars game, because power armor to the SRW development team qualifies as mecha. Whether that ever happens will depend on if they could plausibly fit into the story of a mainline game, or if the mobile games want to have an event, and their owners are willing to let them use the IP. Hell, they actually technically already have had them for a round, as the Symphogear girls were already in the magical-focused crossover game Super Heroine Chronicle, so who knows?
修行の成果を見せる。考えるな、感じろ。常に前に進む。
Hibiki specifically styles her gear to be close combat focused, thus eventually trades out how Kanade used her gear to more specialize in allowing her to close fast and with as much force as she can. And the biggest visual indication of this growth is when midway through Season 1, after repeatedly having trouble even moving in the gear, is that she finally gets it to respond to her and shed excess armor around her legs that keeps tripping her up, allowing her much more freedom of movement. This train of thought thus explains the respective cosmetic alterations each of the gears go through over the seasons, with the greater harmony each girl has with their gears, allowing those gears to grow and evolve to best suit and resonate with their users. It once more keeps the series as wildly distinct from any other, as while magical girls have been allowed to wield weapons before or their magic power manifests as a signature weapon for them, again, Madoka Magica parallels can be found often with things here, the alchemical magic of the series much more aligns themselves with enabling the cast members to have these powers, and how imaginatively they're capable of thinking on how to utilize that theme as a tool in combat. Once again, the success with the presentation of this I have to hand to Katsumi Ono, as no Symphogear fight scene ever comes off the same, and the girls are constantly using new and innovative ways to utilize their powers. Though Hibiki getting her head in the game is not made any easier by the central antagonist of the first season, the immortal Fine. And while she might be fine in her name being a play on final, trust me, all she seeks in the end is an absolute ending conclusion. Fine, an alchemy-wielding mage from ancient times, was responsible for the creation of the noise, and is using them and any other means she can to destroy the Curse of Balal, the original sin humanity was cursed with, whose casting caused the death of her ancient lover. Balal, the Hebrew word for confusion, is the root word from which the word Babel is drawn, as in the Tower of Babel, which Symphogear is drawing reference to with this plotline and story points. Symphogear's universe implies that many religious and cultural mythologies were at some point all real, but the truth behind those myths, long lost and corrupted by time and obscured into the stories we know of in the modern era, with only ancient relics of that past bearing evidence of any sign of the truth to them. The story of the Tower of Babel, in turn, is that the builders of said mythical tower somehow affronted God with its construction, and thus shattered human unity by corrupting their understanding of language, with the story thus being a fictitious reason for why so many dialects developed over the course of our history. The Curse of Balal is that same mythical curse, and its existence continues to prevent true communication and understanding of others from being possible. Now, credit where the series is due. Symphogear has the habit of doing minor context clarification typed retcons, also known as the good type of retcon, to itself after every season, using the expanded runtime of the sequel seasons to clarify details present in prior ones with what is addressed in later ones, all in attempts to shore up and expand the storyline, as in the aftermath of each season, Kaneko was never quite satisfied with what they'd done, so kept working to iron such out, and overall made the story better in doing so. Most of the time, Kaneko does succeed in this. In marathoning the series together, the improvement of the details flow seamlessly into each other, primarily again because the theme about communication gives the show enough leeway to say, oh, what you thought before wasn't quite right, but how you acted from the information you had was still good. So it's not upending everything that was done before by these new revelations, as opposed to later information undermining the earlier stories like happens in, say, Code Geass. The problem with that, though, a lot of people think something new that is introduced into the series in the later seasons always overwrites something old that they then disregard, as opposed to that new detail complementing those prior bits of lore, and thus they mess up their own reading of the thematic narrative as consequence. However, if you're paying attention, that is not ever once done inside the series. The new details only ever add to the prior lore, and never overwrite what was said previously. And this stuff with the Curse of Balal, this is one of those cases. As is shown in the second season, nothing in the world changes even with the curse removed. People still struggle to understand each other due to the differences between people being the central source behind why we often have trouble talking to one another. Personal, political, and moral views vary because of experiences some have had and some have not. Hell, there are people who watched this show as it aired in the 2010s that thought Hibiki and Miku aren't into each other, despite them pretty much already acting like a married couple in their honeymoon period, and disregard a lot of their romance narrative as them being best friends, because they have no experience with proper depictions of gay-positive media or how close friends properly transition into being lovers. Only the versions of things that shoehorn it in just to declare LGBT people exist. As yeah, shoehorning it in just to have it is bad representation. Whereas this show, yeah, no, everything is gay about this and it was intended to be from the start.
そして何よりも響の親友として、いや、嫁として。
But this ties into what Fine was doing, as this shows that she herself was wrong about what the Curse of Balal was, and what it did. It may have caused divides in people via language to form, but the central reasons people struggle to communicate, that curse never affected it, and the loss of her lover made her misassign the blame. And considering she spent millennia working towards ending the curse, it not only comes off as wasted effort, a tragedy that her eternity was all for naught, but a sign of another of the themes of the series, that she became a villain only because she locked herself away from everyone else as she felt she knew best, and was unwilling to reach out a hand to gain support from others to achieve her goal without the costs that are inevitably due. Symphogear does the same thing with 3 of their 5 antagonist factions, each time there being some aspect of subversion without such is executed, so it is never the same thing every time. Each group has their own specialties, powers, abilities, and goals, and yet a lot of them play out with that same core theme. What they were doing in trying to make the world better was either largely not necessary, gone about the wrong way, or handled in such a way that the antagonist group's own actions caused them to fall into conflict with the heroes. The series never at any point says they're doing the right thing, and it never treats them as idiots for going about things the way they are. They have legitimate reasons for going about things the way they do, which is informed by their backstories of what information they have available to them, which, if such were different, they might not have done, as they're not zealots. But it does acknowledge that sometimes people can do monstrous things while believing it will be for the benefit of others, not just themselves.
Shut it!
And yet, it's because the antagonists are not a moral vacuum that we see the strength of Hibiki's character in this. And thus, let's get talking about that. Everything about Hibiki Tachibana's life after the events of the Zwei-Wing Massacre was nothing but a string of suffering. For some inexplicable reason, after it was made public she was the sole survivor, the public ostracized her and blamed her for living, when so many others died, even though that wasn't her fault. She went through torturous physical therapy to recover, cheered on by her parents and Miku, only for the day she finally left the hospital to experience nothing but scorn and bullying. Her fellow classmates belittled her and ruined her things, her parents lost their jobs, random people would vandalize her home, all because she lived. It all eventually becoming too much for her father, who threw himself out of her life. This destroyed much of Hibiki's own personal ego, that while she would often wear a carefree smile, much of that was hiding how much these acts had hollowed her out inside. It only being due to the constant companionship of Miku that she was able to make it through many of those days, and in her own way, recover. However, in one's recovery from depression, there eventually reaches a point of stagnation where you struggle to recover anymore, where you get stuck not because you don't want to get better, but because the next step you need to take are just so difficult that one just finds it easier to continue to self-medicate with what remedies the symptoms, but does not provide the actual cure. This is the point where we first enter with Hibiki in the series, with the respective placebo coming to be her over-reliance on Miku for comfort, to the point she makes any excuse she can to snuggle with her not-at-the-time girlfriend, who she outright says is the sole light in her life. As the bullying she experienced the last 2 years, it never really stopped. Hell, even Hibiki's teachers take pleasure in belittling her for the smallest of slights and not being a good student. But in context to how they act around her, can anyone really blame her for not being the most adept student, especially with the crap she has to deal with as a magical girl? Many characterize Hibiki as the empty-headed idiot trope because of this, as a lack of scholastic excellence is often an indication of one having an idiot protagonist. But let me bust that myth for you. Do you know what a failing grade for a Japanese high school girl at a high-end exclusive academy is, such as the one Hibiki is shown to attend in the series? A 71 out of 100. If you're a woman in Japan and are a C student, that is they consider being an idiot, as the grading curve has become that discriminatory. Whereas if you're a guy, the grading curve is so low, some male high schoolers in their system can skate through with a fucking 50. I've experienced grading curves before, and it's often a consequence of the failure of a teacher and not the student, or the environment and not the students. More than that, Hibiki was out of class in physical therapy for at least half a year. It is not easy to catch up academically after such a long absence. So, for the place to then become associated with suffering, and depression generally making someone unmotivated to do tasks that are associated with why you're made to hate yourself, of course, she's not going to put in the effort to do as well as she possibly could if she even managed to catch up with the rest of her grade in the first place. Her academic struggles are simply a symptom of a larger problem the show is then working her through, which was largely not her fault. As we do see over time that she's not an idiot, but most likely in an environment that is just strangling her ability to learn. This is most well represented by how she develops as a combatant. Genjiro Kazunari, as mentioned before, is her team's commanding officer alongside being Tsubasa's brother-uncle. Long story, I'll get to it later, but the short version is Tsubasa's grandfather is a monster. But the way Genjiro gets Hibiki up to snuff is training her in martial arts, and does that by having her watch Bruce Lee movies with him and learn from the legendary martial artist's movements while overseen by a proper instructor that can correct her form. So her mimicry of Jeet Kune Do eventually develops into her learning an actual style of martial arts. The ability for her to be capable of this is called kinesthetic learning, also known as learning by performing an action, and often structured classrooms strangle out people who learn most effectively through this means. But Genjuro, who likewise is presented as a kinesthetic learner, well, despite the absurdity of the training he takes her and the other girls through, it's nonetheless shown to pay dividends, as by the second season, Hibiki's not just holding her own in battle, but fighting as an equal alongside the other girls who have had their powers and trained them for far longer, with it often being up to her to deliver the final blow.
内なる3号外3号より刑を発すこれなる拳は6号大佐
The other reason she is considered an idiot protagonist, however, is due to her appearing to possess a blind naivete. But that largely is not what we see from her due to that contextual backstory. I read her as someone who was unjustly blamed for a tragedy and was on the verge of losing herself in depression, only for her best friend to hold her hand out and be her lifeline in her darkest moments. And how she reaches her own out in turn to the antagonist of the series is because she can see, plain as day, the suffering others have experienced on their faces, as she saw it on her own every time she looked in a mirror, and knows the difference that can be made in one's life by that simple act of reaching out. This is in turn the largest source of her empathy and strength, the ability to seek understanding with others, because she knows what it's like to have everything stripped away and wanting it all back. Thus, while even in series the other cast members see it as naive to assume their enemies will by default surrender just because you reach out to them, that is not what Hibiki is doing. Hibiki's own conduct is making it clear that she's saying to them by this act that their enemies can stop what they're doing at any time and it won't escalate further. That it's on them how this will end. And if need be, she will knock them down on the floor to stop them.
分かり合いましょうそこまで分かり合うつもりはうっさいバーカ
Though her coming to have the determination to do just that, to hold out one hand in reassurance and empathy while still being able to close the other to deck them in the schnoz, is also part of her arc. As again, she's not been training her whole life for this role as a warrior as Tsubasa was. She wasn't abducted from their homes and families to be experimental gear wielders like Maria, Kirika, and Shirabe were in their backstories. Nor did her personal tragedy drive her to master her gear like Chris. She spends the first half of the series playing catch-up to them in this regard. But while the other girls' respective origins have closed off this path to them by and large, as it broke or damaged many of their ability to have empathy, at least on the scale Hibiki shows, there is still respect shown that she has the strength of will to still be able to offer that despite everything that's happened to her, to still be able to smile despite her hardship, which they in turn struggle to do.
人が人を助けていいのは自分の手が直接届くところまでなんじゃないかって。俺はこんぐらい届かないことはありますけど、欲望だとしてもこんぐらいなら手に負えますしね。
Though as Hibiki begins to be driven down the path of character growth thanks to her gaining the ability to help and save people, this unfortunately leaves Miku behind, which is where we should also address her as well. For as much as Hibiki was dependent for years upon Miku to feel better about herself, well, there's a bit of context that is constantly forgotten about why Miku did so. Miku was the reason why Hibiki was at the Zweiwing concert in the first place. And that was the reason why her best friend was harmed and then suffered years of abuse as consequence. Thus, why Miku was incapable of leaving her was overwhelmingly because of guilt. Guilt that has inevitably put up a wall between them, and much like Hibiki, left her just as damaged and stuck in a stagnant state, unable to overcome that guilt, which can only be sated by comforting Hibiki. But as Hibiki herself begins to improve mentally because of the challenges her new duties push her to overcome, her making new friends and connections, and seemingly to pull away from Miku's arms, it threatens to bring the entire house of cards holding them both up crumbling down. Most of the breakdown that is showcased between them in the first season ends up predicated on one single thing: that Genjuro and the support team that later becomes known as Song want her to keep her identity as well as Tsubasa's as a gear wielder secret so their enemies won't come after them, especially as they have other magic relics in their care that could be stolen and used against them. This secret is not Hibiki's to tell, and yet when Miku inevitably witnesses Hibiki transform and fight the noise, her shock at the revelation that Hibiki kept something from her exposes how their supportive relationship was on the threshold of turning into something more toxic, with it all predicated under the insidious thought of, if she kept this from her, then what else is Hibiki keeping from her? Could it be that Hibiki secretly hates Miku for what happened, blames her for her suffering? And if that could be true, is everything she's done to make up for it all for nothing? And possibly forcing Miku to face the reality of Hibiki being ready to leave her behind. And she cannot handle that. That train of thought and perspective on the characters explains every single aspect of Miku's actions throughout the first season and the subsequent ones. It is not that Hibiki used Miku as a crutch and Miku is enabling her victimization to feel better about herself. Nor is Miku cuddling Hibiki. But that they both have this festering black thing between them caused by the massacre that neither is willing to approach because they fear losing the other by them addressing it, even as it prevents both of them from moving forward as they are paralyzed by the thought of losing the other. And let me restate, the show makes it clear how much the two love each other. It really does. But a key part of recovering from trauma is wanting to be better not for others, but for yourself as well. And while spouses and lovers can't help with that, while one is battling their own insecurities, they're not capable of giving the proper commitment to be in a mutually beneficial relationship as long as that piece of themselves lost through that trauma is still missing. As I've said before, the best romances I've ever seen are the ones where the two involved are made to be better people because they have their lover in their lives, and that lover encouraging them to be better for themselves and not just for others. And we do see that with them. For it's through the series' events forcing them out of stagnation that they're able to confront that festering black thing before it tears them apart. This is addressed inside the show by Miku, after this revelation, coming to learn more and more of the conflict against these magical forces, ultimately forced to accept that Hibiki had good reasons for not telling her. And as the first season ends, she ends up broken by the possibility that Hibiki might have actually died. While such is initially a feint by Kaneko on the matter, that line of thought is instead thrust into central focus in the second season thanks to Gungnir itself. Hibiki's relic weapon, Odin's Divine Spear, is a magical artifact known as the God-slaying Spear, and it does this by turning the power of those it fights back upon their wielders by absorbing and reflecting that power back at them in a single piercing point. However, thanks to the shard embedded within Hibiki, she herself becomes the spear, and as she over time absorbs more and more energy from their battles, the shard inside her begins to grow. Each of the Symphogear are made from fragments of these mythical relics, but due to the shard within Hibiki not being stored in a control crystal like the others, the safety limiters imposed upon them don't exist in Hibiki. Thus, the power she's absorbing is not being discharged, but is instead being fed back to the relic so it can regenerate. And though that endows Hibiki with greater and greater power, a berserker mode transformation seen in the first two seasons, and even the capability to regenerate her arm after it's bitten off, once again, Symphogear is suffering. Well, once they know of the ultimate cost of what's happening to her, and it's determined that there's nothing any of them can do to stop Gungnir from killing Hibiki, it starts Miku on a premature cycle of grief, becoming desperate to find any way to stop Hibiki from either fighting so the damage Gungnir is doing to her won't get worse, which is shown she can't do, as even while not transformed, Gungnir is still active in Hibiki's body, or alternatively, begin to fight herself so Hibiki doesn't have to, which is where the antagonist of the second season, the deranged Dr. Ver, comes in and offers her a deal with the devil, alongside the 7th Symphogear relic.
雷先受尽雷击。
All to save the woman she loves. Like I said earlier, Symphogear is Madoka Magica, but through the proxy of the series focusing more on character progression being behind the actions they make than story progression. With this love story, while Hibiki is sharing Madoka's role of a selfless magical girl that puts saving others before herself because it fills a void that has been torn out of her, Miku is the Homura Akemi in the respective tale, selfishly refusing to let go of what she loves to absolve her of her own guilt and failure in the past to stop the suffering of those she adores. But due to how Madoka Magic is built, they're never allowed to have it out, never allowed to stand as equals. And after in the Rebellion movie and Homura descends into becoming a devil just to bring Madoka back to the same world as her, their inability to communicate properly has resulted in things reaching the point of being irreconcilable. I don't know if Gen Urobuchi will ever get back to that franchise to try and resolve things. I think he ended that where he wanted to, with it being a story about the lengths one will go to for those they love, and I'm fine with that. But there's still that part of me that wants to see those two, and characters like them, to be able to achieve that reconciliation, and ultimately, salvation. Guess what Symphogear does? Miku's relic, Senshojin, based upon the Mirror of Tsukiyomi, is the most powerful of the Symphogears, able to, with the energy beams it releases, destroy alchemical-derived magics and technology. Meaning, it's not just the ultimate weapon against the noise, or capable of destroying magical barriers keeping sealed weapons sealed. That's why said deranged Dr. Ver actually gave it to her. He needed someone to use it to break one of those seals with its power. But it is capable of entirely erasing the existence of anything the Symphogears create and the powers of the relic themselves. But while Miku is a compatible user of Senshojin, the relic itself is incomplete at the time she uses it. Meaning as much as Hibiki's relic is killing her, at that same moment, what Miku's guilt is driving her to do is likewise doing the same to her. And it's only by the two trying to save the other from that damned fate that they finally allow that black thing that's formed between them to be exposed, and resultantly confronted with the power of their songs. Well, that is not the end of their mutual arc as lovers, and will still have farther to go on such in the following 3 seasons. Had the series not gone past G, it would have felt as a complete narrative arc about their true reconciliation and capability to move on from that one moment in their lives they had been stuck on. But as the series continued past the 2nd season, the subsequent seasons more allowed Hibiki's character story to progress farther than that, to allow her further chances by which to regain parts of herself that she had lost. Such as in GX, her having it out with her father, who actually acknowledges how much he screwed up by deliberately giving Hibiki every reason to hate him guilt-free, without having to give up those she loves to do it. The storyline with Hibiki's father gets some deserved criticism, that there are legitimately some caustic groups of parents out there that you should throw out of your life so you don't just keep getting used or abused by them. But again, what Symphogear makes clear by showing the state Hibiki's father is in is that he knows how bad what he did is and doesn't want his family to forgive him for it. Because he himself hasn't forgiven himself for what he did. but by the fact that he acknowledges a need to atone, shows he can work towards redeeming his past action. And while it's admittedly not handled well, especially in the eyes of those with awful parents, it's nonetheless part of Hibiki's own desire to confront the black thing between her and Miku so they can be happy together in the future, that she lets him have his chance to earn his own redemption. Which moves her farther towards the point that Miku herself has reached in being open to being her lover, it just being a matter of time before Hibiki herself feels she's ready to say those all-important words.
私の大好きを二度と手放さないために
However, before all of that, and returning to the moment back in G, with the two purified of any curse laid upon them thanks to Shinshojin's power, it is shown that even this has consequences for them down the line, which the series smartly remembers and exploits. As after this point, neither of them are affected by the Curse of Bilal, and what its true purpose was. But with that diatribe about the main character done, let's shift things back to the literal sword woman. Tsubasa Kazunari is arguably the most out of touch with reality of the main girls, though not by her own design. Born into the Kazunari family whose clan head, Fudo, is a nationalist scumbag believing in his family's divine mission to protect Japan, Tsubasa was driven from youth by her grandfather to succeed him in this role, being shaped into being Japan's ultimate sentinel. Guardian, protector, God, the subs are inconsistent on the word they want to use for that. And then, despite this, she found out her passion in life was to sing, and it derailed most of Fudo Kazunari's ambitions. While Tsubasa's father did everything to encourage her passion, revelation that her father was not her father, and her grandfather had actually slept with her mother to subsequently give birth to her, meaning her father and uncle were in fact her genetic half-siblings. Sidebar? Ew. Ugh. Well, it broke whatever semblance of family she had. However, the Kazunaris were tuned into the potential advantages to heretical magical technology as a new means of defense for the world and Japan, thus collaborated on the Armed Gear project, which Tsubasa subsequently discovered to be a natural wielder. Fudo then sought to use her musical talents for the betterment of Japan through the Armed Gear system. This, subsequently, is how Tsubasa met and fell for Kanade. Kanade, an orphan whose parents were members of the Armed Gear project, witnessed them dying in a noise attack before being taken in by the Kazunaris, with her forming the idol duo Y-Wing as cover for their activities as gear wielders. More than that in the series isn't told, but Tsubasa was greatly affected by her death, to the point of it driving her for the longest time to her own death wish, refusing to draw anyone else into what she thought of as her battle, to the point she didn't even consider herself human anymore, almost devoid of the lively song that first drew her and Kanade together.
私とて人類守護の務めを果たす先森。こんなところで折れる剣じゃありません。
It's very likely that had Hibiki, and subsequently Chris, not gotten through to her, that this may have continued with her to her last day, forcing herself to be a solo vanguard keeping her compatriots out of everything, suffering injuries she didn't need to suffer, fighting enemies she didn't need to face, until it would have killed her, ironically leaving her as naught but the puppet of her sire. It, however, is because she's forced to confront this, thanks to her companions not leaving it alone, that she comes to see she's not on her own, and she can strive for her dreams as a world-class idol, with mic in one hand and sword in the other. Tsubasa's relic draws its basis from Ame no Habakiri, the Blade of Heavenly Wings, one of the swords the Shinto deity Susanoo used to slay the legendary Yamato no Orochi. As such, Tsubasa's abilities allow her to draw swords from her body. Her boots have swords built into them, and due to the part of the legend of Susanoo being that his sword could itself shapeshift, Tsubasa can create swords of varying sizes.
壁呼ばわりとはぶしつけな剣だ
And eventually, due to her own character growth, being able to convert the swords on her legs into bladed wings of Hermes. Though there is an unfortunate translation error made about her blade, which is the show's own fault. At one point, the show, not the fan subs, translated the name of Ame no Habakiri as Heaven Rend, which some of the fan subs of the series then adopted. This is part of what I was going on about earlier when I was saying, and the fan subs are no better, as they blindly trusted what the show presented in its animation several times, instead of confirming if the show might have made a mistake and the existing transcripts were correct, or if they took the wrong context from it, which the fan subs and the fandom do a lot with certain things. As Ame no Habakiri is a proper name for something. You don't translate that. If it was a nickname, code name, or superhero name, that would be different, but this is not one of those exceptions. However, there is still a logic behind it, as Ame no Habakiri has at times been referred to as the sword that rends the heavens. Like, have you seen any anime that does that infinite-length, sky or planet-cutting sword? You often see it as a companion to anything making use of the brave perspective stance. And as that Digimon clip of the Digimon version of the God Susanoo should clue you into, yeah, that Infinite +1 sword attack draws mythological basis from Susanoo. Thus, while translating Tsubasa's relic as Heaven Rend is wrong, there is at least a logic to it. But despite her martial and musical prowess that makes her the senior to all but one of the full team gathered, well, there is nonetheless one major Achilles heel of the character. She has no common sense at all regarding mundane things, to the point of being a caricature of a stereotype regarding her inability towards household tasks, or driving. It's an acknowledged recurring gag that she cannot get on a motorcycle without crashing it, though that is as much because of her using them as a weapon in battle or her being attacked while on one, instead of her deliberately crashing them. Less defensible is her lacking awareness of monetary value due to her family mostly managing her finances for her, and the walking disaster that results when she ends up in her friends' kitchens. Most of that is explicable again by how she was raised without exposure to the normal world, too busy being trained to be her sire's pawn or as a weapon to really enjoy the outside world, and that being part of what her camaraderie with the other girls brings into her life. Unfortunately, due to much of Tsubasa's character arc resolving itself within the first 2 seasons, it takes some time in the series to really focus on her and her family's situation again. That isn't to say it's not laid out in GX and AXZ. Her uncle brother Genjuro is the team's commanding officer after all, nor that she's a non-character after a certain point. However, as the cast gets bigger, she ends up playing more supporting or collaborative roles in the story, and progression of a personal character arc gets subsided. Though what we do see is again once more informed by the actress portraying her. Nana Mizuki was originally trained to be a strict traditionalist performer by her father, which chafed against her own preferences and, well, voice as a singer. If you've listened to much of her discography, you see a recurring trend to her compositions in that they're very modernist or blend in techno tracks or Western instrumentation, and are generally distaffed from more Japanese traditionalist, for lack of a better term, iconography to her music. This hasn't changed that overtly throughout her career, where they're mixing in new and old throughout her performances. But it isn't out of a loathing for how she was trained or her animosity with her father, more that such did not suit her correctly, and she strove to experiment with the new to find her true voice in the art, which has been a large part of making her an outstanding talent. However, with Tsubasa, she's admitted to adoring the role, as it allowed her to take advantage of her older fundamentalist training, without Tsubasa's music in the series does use those traditionalist styles, but done in a more modernist way, bridging the traditional past and revolutionizing it to suit the needs of the future.
ね、ちょっと気づいちゃったわけですよ。曲のタイトルを見たときにね、先ほど今聞いていただいたのが月下美人っていうんですね。人の字が刃になってるんですね。で、クリスも頑張れとキスで頑張れとバレットがかかってるわけでしょ。二人だけダジャレじゃないと思ったわけ。
And the arc resultant of that with Tsubasa's sire also becomes reflective of this. Nationalists by political ideology strive for the past, to control and revert things to ways they think were better as it suits them and only them, not understanding that just because it might be better for them does not mean it is better for everyone, or that past is what they thought it was just because they might have had power at that point and are keeping it from being better. Things are not that way anymore for a reason, after all. And we see from Tsubasa's interactions with Fudo that she is fed up with tradition strangling her life, and will ultimately fight to free herself from it, and the stagnation such enforces upon the world. It is important to say, however, that no matter how awful Fudo is, he was not, in any way, meant or written to be allegorical to Nana's real father, but the relationship the fictional characters share reflects in some ways an expression of the complexities she herself had with her dad, which were not able to be resolved, as he did not live to see her role and subsequently the songs that used the skills and style he passed on to her, and he was supportive of her finding her own path in her career, even if he disagreed with the direction it took. So the best way of viewing the allegory the show utilizes through this is Fudo can represent some of the unvoiced issues Nana had with her father, while the man who Tsubasa believed was her father but turned out to be her half-brother reflects the supportive man he ended up being, which led to her outstanding real-life career. And the moment of that revelation in GX, with it tying into that season's recurring narrative arc and the effect that plays on Tsubasa, is just wonderful.
夢を見続けることを恐れるな。
剣にあらず夢に向かって羽ばたく翼。貴様の哲学に翼は折れぬと心よ。
この歌って。
However, this at last brings us to the third co-star of the series that I have not talked about yet, despite her being the most popular member of the cast, bar none. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, allow me to introduce you to the team's resident tsundere, Symphogear's breakout character, Chris Yukine!
ほら、こんなに大きい会場でこんなに奥の方までたくさん人がいるから、こんなところでダジャレなんて言う気ねえよ。言う気ねえよ。ゆきねクリスだけに。
Chris's life for the longest time was hell. Her parents, dead, having been relief workers killed by a terrorist attack. After that, taken in by Fine to serve her at her whims. Her goals, denied by the heroes protecting a violent status quo. Her own will, suppressed via mistreatment and outright abuse by Fine, who treated her as her own personal slave, in a far less caring way than the Kazanaris treated Tsubasa. All to turn her into a weapon for Fine to use to claim her own goals in destroying the curse of Balal. And yet, Chris endured all that pain and hardship because Fine promised her that were she to succeed in her goals, it would usher in a world where the atrocities that caused the loss of her family would never happen again. And that is a drive for her actions and anger throughout much of the first season. As if these heroes are all about saving people, then why the hell are they standing in her way?
I am a tiny snowball with huge knockers, and my rage knows no bounds!
Chris, however, is not an idiot, and can recognize that Fine is just using her. Thus, the storyline eventually reaches a point where, due to Hibiki's openness and an encounter with Miku that actually helps Miku gain context to the battles Hibiki's been fighting, that Chris ultimately comes to switch sides and fight with the other girls in search of a better tomorrow the right way. While her conduct under Fine is not the largest focused on, you do see the greatest thing that differs her from Hibiki. Hibiki often gets stuck on trying to determine what the best course of action to take is, most significantly in the opening arc of GX, where her indecision ends up paralyzing her to the point she temporarily loses the capability to use Gungnir's power. This happens to her, ironically, because she's seen so many people by this point make the wrong decision rashly, and the harm that can do in escalating instead of resolving a situation. And the living example of that is the regrets Chris herself shows. Whereas Chris acts rashly in the moment, and yet if that decision she makes is shown to be a bad one, she ends up playing that moment over and over and over again in her head, tormenting herself with the memory to try and turn over in her head, what could I have done different? What could I have done better? This is, in truth, an expression of the trauma she suffers from the loss of her family, which ends up brought up most centrally in the 4th season AXZ, when she comes into contact with the woman her parents were helping that failed to find a bomb in a shipment of supplies they were assisting with, which got them killed. Even years later, both women share the scars of that moment. And during another noise attack, Chris is left in that same no-win scenario. That woman's brother forced into physical contact with the noise, and Chris making the hard decision to shoot his leg off, so the consequences of the noise organic matter destruction won't eat him alive. And as a result, both end up reliving that same mutual trauma, just this time from the other's perspective. While I skipped over G and GX's own expressions of that same character arc, and yes, they do it differently every time, so it is a progressive arc for her, I feel this moment and event best represents and contextualizes her actions from those seasons. Her driving herself to be better from the examples of those around her, and yet by her own standards and expectations always coming up short, which in comparison to those others leaves her wanting. This in turn explains her adorable tsundere-ness. Good executions of the tsundere character trope have less to do with the characters bearing that trait being violent maniacs, but their acts of soon showcasing for the audience said characters' vulnerability and insecurities. What they feel is embarrassing, or their own weaknesses, and their discomfort in showing them for a variety of reasons, most centrally being fear of rejection. The key, then, to writing good tsundere characters is to not have them being belligerent, violent bitches all of the time, nor have them abuse other characters unnecessarily or unjustly, but have their soon tendencies be a character trait. This is where a lot of characters trying but failing to count as tsunderes often cross the line, and their anger and belligerence towards others stopped being a trait at that point, but their violence became all that is remembered about the character. And yet, while Chris is soon to Hibiki and Tsubasa, it does take different than expected forms. Chris has for the longest time had no one as emotional support. Thus, she has legitimate problems letting down her guard towards others, which she covers by the expected soon bouts of anger or rebuke. And it's mainly directed at them because she envies Hibiki's own capacity to retain her ability to smile, which she denies with the expected tsundere declaration of Baka. And similarly, Tsubasa's professional detachment and compartmentalization of her own pain. And her struggles and second-guessing to find her own way, which complements them by not just being the gun in their fist sword and gun trinity, acts as part of her arc, ultimately becoming the girl among them, specializing in thinking of out-of-the-box ways to solve their crises. Hibiki the direct fist opening their hands to turn the enemy, Tsubasa the elegant sword serenading a swift death to evil, and Chris the girl with heavy artillery around the corner, always ready to have her companions' backs, resolved to prevent the atrocities she lived through from ever happening again. Her arc thusly comes through as the strongest of them besides Hibiki's, as it is in constant evolution throughout the seasons. And with Chris naturally being an adorable character, it's plain to see why she stole her own chance to be in the spotlight, as her arc to find her true self and who she wants to be in the future, as seen throughout the series, is just beautiful.
まるで雪音のようなじゃじゃ馬っぷり。
だったら乗りこなしてくださいよ先輩つなぎだ手を引っ張る私はこいつらのように笑えない。いや笑っちゃいけないんだ。まっすぐ選ぼうフューチャリズム。じゃ学校に行ってくる。正直まだ慣れないし。
愛されキャラだと立花響から聞いていたのだが、
目どころはやっぱりそこがご飯ご飯私では黄色が似合わねえ大大出力
野菜もさい人の顔を見て吹き出すとは無礼なやつだな。
単純クリア飛び道具で接近してってありなんだよな。まあそんな気はしてたけど。南極犬たちにとってなんて過酷な世界。全部の手を食らいやがれプチョ変座だ。
Arguably, though, Chris is the most insane with the transmutation she herself pulls. Her relic, Ichival, drawing mythological basis from the nameless bow of Odin. But when you see what she pulls, her violent imagination has allowed her to change her gear to be far beyond a simple bow. It usually manifesting as crossbows, but expanding into standard twin magnums, and jacks itself up to Gatling guns, missiles launched from her skirt, and gigantic missiles firing from her back. If you want a Macross missile massacre with a side of Daka coming from a 5'1" tall hourglass of power, you call upon Chris Yukine. The ironic hilarity of that being that Chris, the character, despite ending up the shortest member of the cast, is actually taller than her actress. Seriously, Aihei Takagaki is surprisingly tiny. Chris's arsenal is also where the series is the most overt with its mecha illusions. Literally every armament of Chris's directly drawing from some scene or moment from Mobile Suit Gundam. Her signature twin Gatling guns being the most obvious one, as it's calling upon the heavy arms custom from Gundam Wing. But her sniper rifle poses exactly mimic the Dynames and Charidim from Gundam 00, her missile launchers some heavy destruction units, and her own power-armored equipment when she's in her Gear Super form is a crab motif version of the Meteor units from Gundam Seed. Once again informing many fans' opinion that Symphogear is mecha by way of power armor, just with a stylization of magical girl henshin heroes. Though among all the mecha and henshin hero references Chris makes, there is one that is oddly missing. There is not, at any point in the series, where Chris is ever allowed to allude to or echo the wave motion gun from Space Battleship Yamato. And considering how iconic that series is and how the wave motion gun is one of the single most referenced weapons in fiction, with bow-mounted guns like that popping up all over the place, it is a bit baffling that over the 5 seasons, they never permitted her to make her own allusion to it. However, that isn't to say she's never gotten a chance to associate with it, and in this, I have to give major props to Studio Xebec. For in 2019, when they did the second Yamato remake series, Space Battleship Yamato 2202, they cast Aihei Takagaki as the character Saki Todo, commander of the Yamato's sister ship, the Ginga. And while the Ginga is not equipped with a wave motion gun, it does have the next best thing. A system that uses harmonic resonance to enhance the power of wave motion power technology.
波動エネルギー注入。コスモリボン発動。
As I have often said the last few years, Xebec knew the hell what they were doing. But there's also another hang-up when it comes to Chris's relic. Ichival is said by the series to be the legendary bow, or crossbow, of Odin. However, throughout Norse mythology, that is not exactly the case. The name Ichival as a relic actually originates from the Fire Emblem franchise. Fire Emblem has a history of using mythological weapons as the super gear in the games, and in one of them, they pulled a bunch of Norse relics for such, one of which they claim to be Odin's bow. And, well, here's where the confusion begins. Odin in Norse mythology would often disguise himself as a one-eyed old man to travel the Norse lands in secret, helping in his own ways the heroes of the Norse legends. In the story Gesta Danorum, a one-eyed old man assists the hero of the story, Thuning, in his quest against his enemy, Hating. And in this story, this old man is shown wielding a bow that can fire 10 arrows at once to fell the enemies they face en masse with superior firepower. Gesta Danorum, however, and by the way, if I'm mispronouncing any of these names, I apologize, I am not versed in Norse pronunciation, never names this bow, and thus, well, as far as any of us can find, Fire Emblem came up with it themselves. The game's creators likely took initiative from another prominent bow wielder of Norse mythology, Ullr, U-L-L-R, I have no idea about pronunciation with this, and named the bow after Ullr's home, Ydalir, Y'-D-A-L-I-R, with it roughly translating mean U Dale or U Valley. U to Japanese is Ichi, shorten valley to Val, and you get Ichival, which through cultural osmosis and distillation ended up becoming the common name of the weapon. Except in one place, a certain magical index. In the A Certain Magical Index New Testament light novels, which as of recording this video have not been adapted into an anime series, they introduce the magical god Othinus, who draws powers and abilities from the legends of Odin. Index's author Kazuma Kamachi is pretty well read when it comes to world mythological fiction, and while he doesn't fully bind his series to strict alignment with them, as he can be pretty creative and flexible with what each magic or psychic ability user in his story can end up doing with powers based on whatever their medium is, he still tends to abide by what they said is plausible. And yet, he too has Othinus craft herself a crossbow based off a bow Odin is said to wield that can fire 10 arrows at the same time. But what is important to note about this is Kamachi did not fall into the Ichival trap. Othinus saying that Odin's bow was nameless, abiding by the terms of the original Gesta Danorum on the matter, even if the tale is still sharing in the assumption that said old man in that story was Odin. And Kamachi certainly had every opportunity to. While Othinus as a character was introduced in New Testament Volume 4 in 2012, the reveal of her possession of a weapon drawing upon that bow's legend did not appear until New Testament Volume 9, which released at the beginning of 2014, after Symphogear had already begun to air. So between the two, if Kamachi were drawing from just cultural osmosis as everyone else about it seemed to, well, he certainly would have had the excuse to. However, with Chris's introduction and her subsequent fights with Hibiki and Tsubasa in the series, are we in turn properly introduced to the Symphogear's last resort final option. For while the gears are powered and strengthened by song, there is one specific melody that unlocks all the limiters of their power sets, but immediately acts as the aforementioned double-edged sword, all cast with intention that with its use, that it ends the battle. But this is also where we get to what the Western fandom has turned into an idiot ball of an argument, the last-ditch resort of the Symphogear power set, the last song each of them can sing before the curtain calls for the end of their performance. This technique, as shown, always performing the same melody, is the Zesho, which gives the full series its title, Senki Zesho Symphogear, or as the translation would say, Swan Song of the Valkyries, which is, in turn, where the argument comes in, as the fandom keeps insisting that Zesho does not translate as Swan Song, but instead as Superb Song, though to avoid the argument, most just refer to it as the Zesho. The song itself is first seen in giving context early in the series, the power released from it being magnitudes beyond what the gears can normally perform, endowing them for a short time immense power by which to surpass their own limits. Unfortunately, the technique is one built directly into the gears and will always do damage. Each of the gears was created through the refinement and reformatting of varied ancient relics, but not the complete relics themselves, only fragments. While completed relics themselves hold great power, shown by Chris initially using the completed Neshutan relic to fight Hibiki and Tsubasa, and entirely crushing them by doing so, that power of a completed relic is ultimately capped. Whereas Symphogear relics, because they're made from fragments that harmonize with their wielder, can grow in strength to surpass that capped power with time and compatibility, their full limits broken through the performance of the Zesho, whose entire score and aria speaks of Fine's constant failure at seeking an end to the curse of Balal. What the Zesho is and how dangerous it is to use is presented very early in the series, its successful performance being what kills Kanade due to the injuries she took beforehand, being exasperated by the damage the performance subsequently did to her, to the point her body literally falls apart in Tsubasa's arms. And even Tsubasa herself barely survives her own casting of it, when she unleashes it to stop Chris when she's using Neshutan.
絶唱による肉体への負荷は極大。その代償と思えばこれくらい安いもの。まさに他者も自分も全てを破壊し尽くす滅びの歌。
However, it's shown over time that higher rates of harmonization with the gears subsequently lowers the damage the users take from it, though after every successful solo performance of it, the singer still ends up harmed, needing to end their time in battle to recover physically from the damage they took if they survived casting it. Full out, this does not stop happening all series long whenever someone individually casts it. The only time the Zesho does not harm the singer is when they do not succeed in unlocking the full power of the song, either caused by too poor a synchronization with their gears to call upon it, or they otherwise do not complete the song. Thus the power gained from it is within tolerable limits. There are also scenes where the melody is interrupted or suppressed, preventing the power buildup from occurring that damages the wielders, as it is the power buildup and its spiking beyond a gear wielder's capacity to control or direct away from harming them is what causes this harmful backlash. But outside of those circumstances, the technique, when performed alone, always unleashes more power than any Soul Symphogear user can handle. The phrase Superb Song, in turn, is only used once during Symphogear G, where in the midst of a battle against a large number of noise, Hibiki, Tsubasa, and Chris performed an attack that combines the power of their respective Zesho, the technique first being referred to as the S2CA, the term by which the attack is called in all future uses of it, which is the first sign of the Symphogears performing together to get around the power spikes the individual wielders suffer, which takes advantage of Hibiki's synchronization with Gungnir, whose special ability is to absorb and redirect power to drain off the excess energy spikes so no one is harmed by them, and the backlash they suffer subsequently does not occur, which, after they prepare the song, Tsubasa then declare... This is where the argument is subsequently rooted, as Superb Song was never even considered a plausible translation choice before this point, and I've asked fans who insisted Superb Song where that argument comes from. But every time, literally every time I asked, the proponents of the Superb Song translation use this scene as their sole evidence to say that this scene is declaring what Zesho is supposed to translate as. Again, I asked if there was any other reference or blog post from the fan translation teams to see where this came from, but every single one just cited G and this scene alone, and every other rationale is just based out of that one moment or misunderstandings of a translation. An example of this, there is an instance that swan song cannot possibly be the translation, as swan song is an idiom, and idioms are not used in translation. And the thing is, they are technically correct. Swan song is not a literal translation of Zesho. But what they don't get is, well, superb song is not a valid translation of Zesho at all in any valid context by that same reasoning. And moreover, descriptive idioms like swan song are used all the time in translation if a better term or phrase is not available, and if that idiom fits the definition of the term that is trying to be defined. As all idioms are words or phrases whose meaning is not apparent from the words themselves. Hell, the Japanese language has a shit ton of idioms that are in common use in their language, so that excuse does not fly. And the language and etymology of the word Zesho itself backs me up on this, alongside Discotext translator for the series themselves, finding on their own that swan song is, by definition, synonymous to what Zesho itself is defined as. But unfortunately, to explain that to you all, I kind of need to get into a larger tangent on translation to evidence that. So to start that off, I'd like you all to look at the Ghost Girl archetype from Yu-Gi-Oh! Each of these cards is written with a homonym for their name. Their kanji translates as one thing, while the furigana, the katakana characters that showcase how the words are pronounced, act as allusions to another. The Ghost Girl card, Ghost Ogre, and Snow Rabbit has the kanji in its name written to mean Ghost Ogre, while the pronunciation of those characters is written to be Yuki Usagi, and thus are the same that would translate on their own without context of the kanji to Snow Rabbit. With context provided by the card's art, Konami's intended meaning for the card's name is one that has an equal representation of a Ghost Ogre girl and the White Rabbits. Thus, in English import of the card, one name that was a layered pun in Japanese was represented instead by both names, as they were shown to both be valid. The "it's both" aspect is something that can normally frustrate translators where only one or another can allow it to be valid. But this also provides an idea of the normal hierarchy of how and when to translate something, as the kanji is always given the higher priority with regard to providing the context of use. The series Kamen Rider Gaim had one of its translation groups trip headfirst into this problem with the issue of kanji and furigana, due to them botching translating the word sengoku. This one specific group assumed that sengoku always, in every circumstance, translated as the phrase warring states or warring, thanks to the phrase warring states period being attached by Westerners to the era known as the Sengoku Jidai. However, the word Sengoku does not literally translate to warring states. The kanji the word Sengoku uses actually translates as country in civil war, as during that period, the country was still united as one nation under the Japanese emperor. It was the government of the provinces that were fighting among themselves to fill a void in their administration after the previous caste structure had collapsed.
これって
そいつは家紋だ。戦国武将のな。
どうして戦国武将の家紋を現場に
The Americanized view of a state is unique to the Americas and not applied in other regions of the world. However, the idiom, once applied, stuck. But when applied back to Kamen Rider Gaim, this one group only looked at the word Sengoku being spoken, which was unattached to the associated kanji that defined the translation. That group assuming it would always be the same, even though the individual furigana associated with the Civil War, kanji, sen and goku, can also translate as thousand and awareness of emptiness respectively. Thus, just by looking at the kana, the word can mean awareness of 1,000 empty places, as in places devoid of living, which is consequently an associated idiomatic phrase tied to a different reading of a battlefield, and that the places where battles are fought become nothing but graves to be filled by those slain there. But once more, the kanji being used for Sengoku in Gaim differed in context, most pertinently in regards to the transformation device of the series, the Sengoku Driver, which used these kanji for the driver. As you can see, the second kanji is entirely different, and that changes the meaning of the word entirely to one that did not translate as civil war, or was applicable to the Americanized warring states idiom. The second kanji used here actually would normally read as kyoku, which translates as extreme, with the full kanji being a phrase used to describe an escalation or culmination of warfare and not a civil conflict. And if you were to simplify the translation of the kanji, then the most accurate word to use would not be war or warring, but escalation, as evidenced by the series soundtrack itself, which references that exact word as a translation for senkyoku. Thus, the kanji being used showed itself to not be descriptive of an era, but instead reflecting a theme of the story, which was only made worse when the version of Sengoku that Gaim was using was revealed to be the surname of the character Ryoma Sengoku, and he named the device after himself, with the fan sub that was botching the context of the word, then translating his name as Ryoma Warring to conform to their mistranslation, as they didn't consider the kanji the show was using different than the one that relates itself to the idiom, nor the fact that that isn't how you translate names. In fact, that is in violation to rules about how you translate characters' names. If they are written in kanji, you'll leave them alone and write them matching Japanese phonetics. Both of these examples highlight how the normal hierarchy for translating Japanese tends to work. In order of importance, 9 times out of 10, priority is always given to kanji spellings, as the specific kanji are supposed to mean something specific that only has so many valid translations to it. Or as my Japanese teacher Mari-sen sensei always told us in class, the kanji tells the story. And using a different kanji than normal for a word thus changes the context of it being applied to, and how it translates. Then you move down to katakana, as very often katakana is used for either loanwords from other languages, or specific terminology or names distinct from other characters. And very often katakana is also used as the furigana, denoting how kanji are phonetically pronounced and romanized, either directly above the kanji or to the side of them in parentheses. However, you cannot confuse a loanword with furigana spelled with katakana. It just does not work that way. If the kanji is there, then the kanji takes priority, and any use of a loanword's version of romanization is supposed to be entirely disregarded. And if it's not, then it causes problems with that translation. The most recurring example I have of people not getting that, to the point even professionals have botched this, is actually with the translation of the character Guy Shishio's name from King of Braves Gao Gaigar. As I discussed in my Super Robot Wars reviews, his name is written with the kanji for Victory Song, which can normally be spoken as Kachidoki, Kai, or as you can guess, Guy, romanized G-A-I, exclusively. The confusion around such is his name is a homonym, a word spoken the same but spelled differently, with the English word guy, G-U-I, which in Japanese would be spelled in katakana as a loan word. But the same katakana character the loan word would use is also being utilized for the kanji's furigana, which thus, again, invokes the rule that furigana takes the higher priority over a loan word use of katakana. And if you check the transcripts for Gao Gaigar and any media that uses the series, you see that Guy's given name is always spelled exclusively with the kanji, and his codename Cyborg Guy and Evolutor Guy, which use the loanword form of Guy, is always exclusively spelled in katakana only, as the two are not intended to be compatible. This distinguishing factor between kanji and katakana then tells you that the two uses of Guy are not necessarily supposed to be romanized in the same way, and are contextually supposed to be distinct from the other to distinguish them. Thus, with the kanji and its furigana taking higher priority in the hierarchy, and the loanword form of katakana never being used in the romanization of kanji, the constant use of it is telling you to abide by solely the kanji-specified romanization for his given name, and his superhero code name can then be free to use a different, distinct romanized spelling. And it is 100% a translation error to spell his given name in the loanword form, as the loanword means something different. This error became popular, unfortunately, because the original fan subs of the series were not done with the assistance of transcripts for the show. Thus, the original fan translators didn't know about the show itself telling you this distinction between the two, saw the frames of the series that tell you how his codename is spelled with loanword romanization, and assumed that was the proper way to do both, which it isn't, and that wasn't what the show was saying. Media Blasters, when they later released the series, corrected this error in their translation. But much like the Warring States idiom with Sengoku, the erroneous form became popularized, and discontinuation of the DVDs prevented most from learning of the error, resulting in a cascade of horrible mistranslations of content relating to the series that further compounds the mistake, despite the show's titular mecha literally telling you which one you should be using with how its name is romanized, and its naming coming from the names of its component pieces, including Guy himself. Another common to cite example is actually the title of the series Kill la Kill. Its name is supposed to be Kiru Ra Kiru, which is a Japanese idiom that means cut the dress, as Kiru, depending on what kanji you write the word with, can mean either to wear, as in dressing oneself in clothing, or to cut. But like the Gao Gaigar example, the title exploits a homonym the katakana supplies to both kanji to add in the English loan word that uses the same characters. This is supposed to be a pun name, the use of a loan word intended to make the phrase mean kill the dress, an allusion to the fact that the series is about stopping a race of sentient alien clothing from hijacking and killing humanity, and presented overtly by main protagonist Ryuko Matoi, literally wielding as her main weapon half a sword-sized pair of fabric shears, as she is in the series, literally fighting to kill living clothing. This is the case where this was the localization decided by the creators of the series themselves and no one else, but it is a creative decision that completely obfuscates and confuses the meaning of the title, and thus the intent of the entire series that follows. Similarly, Funimation's translation of Dinozanon itself ran into a problem with homonym loanwords, confusing the loanword for mummy with the loanword for mirror. Despite the scene where it occurred, there's literally a picture of a mummy on screen being discussed. This happened because the Japanese loanword for mummy is itself a misnomer, as a mummified body was first presented to a Japanese museum by a Portuguese salesman, and the preservative mirror was mistakenly presumed by the curator of the exhibit to be the entirety of the mummy itself. Most loanwords and terminology relating to ancient Egypt similarly have an entire frustrating translation discourse surrounding them if you pay attention, as it's not just going from Japanese to English or Egyptian to English, but they're actually going from Egyptian to Portuguese to Japanese to English, and context ends up getting lost along the way. And lastly, I'd like to point out this specific scene of Code Geass where Lelouch v. Britannia first debuts as Zero. Now, a lot of people have joked over the years about this scene, and the specific phrase, zero, as in nothing? And then not understanding what the phrase means. For zero as a numerical value is not an idea native to Japan. In fact, in mathematics, they still use the loan word zero instead of the Japanese word that means zero, rei, and have adopted zero because it is different conceptually than what they once utilized. This is because zero as a numerical value was first introduced to Japan by French mathematicians. Before this point, zero as a value in Japanese math was taken as the absence of something, in the sense of there is nothing there. There is a void where things should be. As opposed to there are no units of something there, everything that was there is no longer there. In the original Japanese sense, it was considered as a placeholder once you run out of something, and not a number that can be counted in and of itself. There is not nothing of something, there is zero of something. Though even to this day, zero in their naming etymology still ties itself to concepts around voids and emptiness, which can still tie into the theming of stories and characters as the starting point before you reach a value of 1. Each of these examples is showing something structurally about the language. With the Ghost Girls, it's how written language can pair with visuals or additional context to create puns or layered thematic story meanings. The Gaim example shows how minor changes in these characters can entirely change their meaning and how they translate, thus what they represent, and often words that translate as phrases require the term be simplified down to an approximation of the term. The Galgagar one presents the importance of acknowledging the priority in the hierarchy with regards to providing a proper translation when multiple varied written forms are in use simultaneously, as the simultaneous use of two distinct forms in reference to the same noun of use means they are then referring to different terms that are distinct from one another and cannot be treated as the same. Now, loanwords never supersede anything written in kanji in the hierarchy. Kill the Kill's case presents how overuse or improper use of loanwords can undermine the surrounding content and the themes that are in play within the story. And likewise, the Dyna Zenon screw-up shows how much a simple screw-up can cause a disastrous loss of context, or even conflict with the context and event being presented. Something that frustratingly keeps happening with Funimation dubs with their worst script writers. And the Code Geass example shows quirks of the language that help both contextualize and distinguish when one places emphasis on a root word or a loan word, and what role in the story that may play. So now we apply that back to Zesho and the kanji used for it. Zetsu and Sho. Sho meaning song, and Zetsu literally translating as the phrase to bring to an end. And that phrase being what the problem is, as it means that literally every word that uses the character for Zetsu translates with an idiom being used to describe the concept their conjugation is attempting to convey, but has also been simplified down to sever, cut off, discontinue, suppress, interrupt, and end, which really are all conceptually synonymous to it, telling you that it's ending whatever is happening in the word it is paired with. If you try to literally translate Zetsu, it always results in this. Thus, most of the time, a simplified approximation of what the phrase is supposed to mean, usually by having a synonymous meaning, is what is used. And thus, let me showcase some examples for you. Probably the most common Zetsu-rooted word you've likely heard is Zetsubo, a conjugation of Zetsu with the character Kibo, meaning hope. Literally, Zetsubo thus reads as, to bring an end to hope. The word acts as a negative tense of a positive tense term, and thus acts as not just its opposite, but its endpoint. You have exhausted your last final hope. You have run out of hope. You have reached the end of hope. And someone who is without hope is said to have fallen into despair. Thus, by that logic, the concept of despair has become most closely attached to Zetsubo, and acts as the go-to simplified translation for the term. It's idiom. The term Zetsume is a combination of Zetsu with Unmei, meaning fate or life, with it meaning one's fated ending or the end of life. In more loose reading, Zetsume can also read as the end of progress. This later reading is what is used in the phrase Zettai Zetsume, which is a Japanese idiom meaning to be in a desperate situation, as it describes the person suffering from such having no options, no way to progress forward. They are stuck in a stalemate and cannot perform an action without failing. They have reached their absolute fated end. The last one I'll cite in turn is Zetsumetsu. Metsu meaning death, the full phrase translating as the end of death. However, this one is important as use of Zetsu always results in a word with a negative tense to it. Thus, this word resultantly does not mean that death has stopped happening, it means that no more death will occur because there is nothing left to die, as everything is already dead. The word is thus synonymous with the concept of extinction, and that is what it resultantly translates as, and the idiom used to represent it. Thus, plug that characteristic of Zetsu back into Zesho. Zetsu is a negative tense word that intones something's ending. Thus, Zesho's literal translation can act as to bring song to an end. When the Zesho in Symphogear is used, with this meaning attached to it, it conveys the idea that this is the singer's last performance before they either die or end up so injured as a consequence that they need to rest and recover, or must retire from the stage of battle for the time being, as singing this song results in the end of their ability to perform, thus must defeat all their enemies with this attack. And culturally in Japan, that last form of Zesho, signifying one's retirement from a performance group, is commonly used when a singer leaves or graduates from an idol group to go solo, or otherwise retires from their careers. And that all makes it literally incompatible with the term superb, whose meaning is excellent, superior, majestic, splendid, or miraculous, which are all positive tense words and phrases. Thus, superb song isn't, has never been, and cannot be a valid translation of zesho. And my discussion of how language works in Japanese backs me up on this, as in that scene in G, they're not relating it as a translation of zesho. Besides that, if they meant to use superb there to begin with, well, the Japanese language already has a word that has the same meaning they could have used. You want to know what it is?
素晴らしいな。素晴らしい。素晴らしい。
素晴らしい。
素晴らしい。
And thus it has to be representative of something else. Crunchyroll's translation of zesho made use of the phrase climax song, as in the climax of a musical. The last song of a performer before the end of the show was the performance's climax, with climax in this use meaning the most important point, a culmination or pinnacle of actions before their fall or ending. Which is close, but not quite what the show kept insisting, which is clued into by the name of the team's combination attack that is afterwards declared to be a superb song, this being the S2CA, the Some S-Word Song Combination Arts. So a word that starts with an S is what the show's staff wanted as the word plugged in here. And of all the possible options, because superb song literally can't be plugged in there because it conflicts with the meaning of zetsu, it just leaves solely swan song as a valid reading and intended translation. And as much as fans of preferring Symphogear fans hate it, that is the most logical option. A swan song, as an idiom, is a phrase used to describe the final performance of a musician or actor before their untimely death or retirement from their career, which has the exact same definition as zesho. The term is rooted in the mournful songs swans make during their mating season, and originally served as a misnomer, as those who didn't know better thought these noises were made only by swans who failed to attract a companion or were separated from their companions. Thus their time to find love and happiness in life has come to an end. This was of course not so, as the performance of a swan's song also ended once they found love. Thus they ended the need to perform one. But because many performers often put their heart and soul into the works they would end their careers with them knowing they wouldn't do so again, or at least not in the same way, well, the name stuck. However, over time the use of the phrase has expanded extensively, and also came to be used to represent when someone bows out of a performance or such reaches its ultimate conclusion. A TV show is ending, so its swan song was its series finale. An actor is bowing out of their role as a long-standing character, so their swan song was their final appearance as them. It's long been dissociated from anything relating to just death, as even after the idiom was popularized, a performer's swan song didn't mean by default their death would happen, and they would never perform again. And now it equally is shown to mean when a musician, actor, or performer needs to retire from a role, rest, or otherwise cannot continue as they were before. Their ability to perform at that time has come to an end. But that does not mean they cannot make a comeback as long as they have not died. Michael J. Fox, an actor I watched a lot of as a kid and was a huge fan of, was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1991, and the worsening of its symptoms forced him to retire from regular acting in 1998. And his swan song for his career was considered him bowing out from his role on the sitcom Spin City. However, after he took time to rest, recover, and seek more extensive treatment for his illness, he was able to on occasion come back as a guest star on numerous series, before in 2020, due to the increasing inability to memorize and speak lines for roles, he chose to retire for good. There were thus 2 swan songs for his career. Ozzy Osbourne's No More Tours tour, also in 1991, was always referred to his swan song tour due to him being misdiagnosed with multiple sclerosis. But much like Michael Fox, after some time to rest, he found himself feeling far better, and ultimately returned with his album Osmosis in 1995. In both cases, these performers' swan songs were not their ending, and they were able to stage a comeback in their respective mediums that to many audiences was described as superb. With full context of Symphogear's themes, about how many of the songs the girls sing are love songs, putting their heart and soul into defying the odds of their death, and yet always having a song that risks killing them in exchange for power to win, whose melody literally translates as the Gears creator's mournful love song towards her lost lover, being the trigger words for the Gears to risk self-destructing? Yeah, Swan Song makes the most sense, as not only are Swan Song and Zesho synonymous with one another in regards to their context of use, even if such is not literal, Symphogear is calling upon both meanings of the phrase. The literal swan song sung by those seeking love, and the idiom meaning a melody that signifies the end.
8000夜声泣いて血を吐くホトトギスその小さな鳥は血を吐きながら歌を歌い続けるという血を流しながら歌い続けた
With the superb song thus being something different. And that difference being it is what happens when they surpass the expected limitations of their gears to overcome their weaknesses. As every time an S2CA is performed, all of the Symphogear wielders join in on the song. And because each of the gears has different peak harmonic wavelengths, their group performance cancels out the extreme spikes in power the gears generate that backlashes upon them, filling the missing gaps in their personal songs through collaboration, and allowing them to safely reach even greater heights of power without negative consequence. The combination of swan songs culminates in a superb melody that cuts out the ending of their story, the end of their life, and allowing it to flourish anew in one grand miracle, culminating in them unlocking the full ultimate power of their gears, which comes to be known as the X-Drive. But despite the show making that pretty clear, well, arguments resulted with one term believed to be replacing another, instead of the two being in association. And this is why I cited both the context of the Code Geass scene and how term replacement really does not happen in Japanese media, or at least not in the way that is being cited. As well, superb song's use as a term in the show, yeah, it's basically non-existent. That one scene in G is the single sole time the English word superb is ever said in the entirety of the series, with it coming off more as a one-off attack name. Every other time discussion of the technique happens, they are either using Zesho to refer to the individual performance, or the S2CA to declare they're combining them, or in reference to the group performance. And as said, Zesho literally cannot translate as superb song due to one being exclusively in negative tense, and the other being exclusively in positive tense, which by definition makes them 100% incompatible, meaning the only logical option left is the swan song combination arts results in the creation of a superb song. And that was what Tsubasa was declaring in that scene in G, which users of the term elsewhere believed was a replacement term, when that was not how Japanese as a language nor translation of it works. Hell, even in context of Symphogear G itself, this is shown later in the season to in fact not be a true superb song as it is, but a false one. As I said earlier about Gungnir, its power is the ability to absorb and redirect energy, and as is explained about the gears in the first season, it is possible to repair a damaged or incomplete gear by the infusion of energy into it through songs or energy absorption. The original Zweiwing concert that began this series was secretly planned by Fine to complete the relic Neshitan by infusing into it the energy of Kanade and Tsubasa's songs, which is the entire reason why she unleashed the noise at the concert to cause the massacre, to force them into a position where they would sing the Zesho and die, the power released achieving her goal, and clearing the stage for new performers she could manipulate to take over, unawares to her manipulations. Now relate that to what is happening to Hibiki in Symphogear G, where the Gungnir shard has begun to rapidly expand throughout Hibiki's body and leave her racked with pain as it devours her at a rate unprecedented in the prior tests of both Hibiki's well-being and her hybridization with the relic. If it was stable for years and her just transforming with its power was not enough to create such an upset before this, then what changed?
エネルギーレベルが絶唱発動まで高まらない。こいつがエネルギーを奪い取っているのですか。
吹き荒れる破壊のエネルギーをその身に無理やり抱え込んで
Yeah, what changed is they assumed it was safe for her to use it because she didn't suffer the backlash. Thus she started singing her Zesho freely. But the reality is she wasn't showing the side effects of the power spiking that results in the backlash, as the power spikes were instead being fed back into the gear to cause it to grow and reform into a complete relic inside of her, which they didn't catch until it was too late and it was already killing her. And that happened because her hybridization with the gear itself results in her Gungnir shard not having the same energy release safeguards the others have that would prevent their uncontrolled absorption and growth to recomplete themselves, which is what causes the backlash in the first place, and would render them unusable as a Symphogear if the relic was ever recompleted. And that is lethal in Hibiki's case because it's fused into her body and would rip itself out of her once it became complete. And one of the central storylines of G is the cast working to prevent that happening. Thus, no, there is no term replacement. Every time a swan song is performed solo in the show, there is shown to be some consequence on the one who does it, and they never become safe to use outside of combining them, as when they're performed together, they're no longer swan songs. For after Hibiki is cured of her hybridized state and she begins to use Gungnir's crystal to transform like the others do, the individual performances of that song are never shown to not have some form of backlash to them. The team primarily relies on the combination technique afterwards to achieve greater feats of power, with Hibiki through Gungnir still absorbing all the excess energy the gears release so it won't be harmful to them, but it consequently also requiring the use of Maria's second relic, Arget Lame, I am most likely still pronouncing that, I have such trouble pronouncing that word, to control the output of energy back to their gears so the power she absorbed doesn't turn them all into literal bombs, regulating the power absorbed and released so there isn't a backlash. This ends up seen most centrally within the final battle against GX's central antagonist, Carol, who through her own alchemy can harness as much power as every person on the planet singing their own Zesho. Her specific use of this term also shows once more why Superb Song doesn't work as a translation for Zesho either, as her thing is she wants to achieve the literal extermination of everyone and everything to reach their absolute ending. This is said by her numerous times throughout the season, as she refers to herself as the murderer of miracles. And her entire motivation as a character is she wants to dissect the world to prove that there is no such thing as a miracle, as she does not believe that miracles can exist. It is thus wrong from a character perspective for her to have any dialogue she speaks translate as Superb Song, or that she is using the power of a Superb Song, as by superb being synonymous with miracle, then she would not ever claim she's taking upon herself the power of any miracle, as her ultimate goal, using the power she wields, is to seek an absolute end. Thus, with the main six's combination technique being capable of surpassing her, to achieve a miracle even in the wake of so much incomprehensible power being used against them, this is why it's better to think of Zesho and Superb Song as two different things, the latter a distinct subset resulting from the former. Because the series itself shows that the harmonious, miraculous melody present in the Superb Song far surpasses anything invoked by one's individual swan song. Hell, you want to know how stupid the you can't translate Japanese words as idioms thing is? Well, fans complain about the swan song translation. None of them ever say anything about Senki translating as Valkyrie. Even though, yeah, Senki doesn't actually translate as Valkyrie, it translates as Flash Knight. However, Senki as a term has undergone an idiomatic transition over the years to acting as a placeholder in translation for equivalent prestigious military ranks and notorious groups of specialized soldiers, such as Chevaliers, Templars, Yuxia, and so on. Valkyrie is just another with similar synonymous terminology that can be plugged in there and provide appropriate contextual sense, as the Symphogears are a group of fast-acting knights for love and justice that appropriately aligns with the etymology of the word. I think the problem is that Symphogear fans, thanks to the fansubbers themselves spreading misinformation, do not understand what an idiom is. And again, all that an idiom is a word whose actual meaning is not apparent from the word or phrase itself. The Japanese language has all sorts of idioms part of its language whose meaning has been lost or changed with the time. So, to say you can't use an idiom part of one language that literally has the synonymous meaning as a Japanese word to translate that word is just imbecilic and tells you just how much one doesn't understand the language. Discotheque, however, because the translators performed their due diligence, saw that Swan Song did make the most sense, and did match synonymously with what Zesho meant, which subsequently led to a lot of context and story thematic clarification the fansubs had thus squandered. Once more, the fansubs are no better than Crunchyroll was in regards to translating the show. The only difference is they at least made an attempt at providing all the songs. Regardless of all of that, and to once more focus on the first season's story, Tsubasa singing her Zesho places her strategically out of action, allowing Fine her chance at her actual goal. The completed relic Durandal, which is left more vulnerable now that the inexperienced Hibiki is the only one left to defend it. What she was not expecting, however, was it to be shown that Hibiki herself has natural resonance with Durandal, it releasing far more power from her presence than any could predict. And it's only because Gungnir is still part of her at this point that the conflict in power sources prevents her from being able to dual-wield the relics, ultimately resulting in Fine obtaining her prized final piece to her era's long goal. Side note on this though, there actually is a dual relic system introduced in the Symphogear mobile game XTU, so I'm a bit baffled that Durandal never came up again in these terms. Maybe it was the base idea for that system there. Oh yeah, Symphogear has a mobile game, based around a version of the story where the team has access to another relic that can peer into and allow the crossing over of other universes. It certainly allows them to do cool crossover events.
いびきだからと甘く見ないで。
But yes, with Durandal in hand, Fine reveals her true goal, to destroy the moon. Oh great, now you're going to invalidate the final episode of Gundam X. And after Chris just finished turning Ichival into cosplay too. But this is because the moon actually serves as the central controller for the Curse of Balal shining down upon the planets. And wow, with a bunch of very stupid sci-fi movies being all about our moon being more than just, a moon, I'm actually even more appreciative of this take on it, as Symphogear's use of this feels vastly less stupid. And with its destruction, humanity could be free of the curse, while also causing the death of billions of people, because destroying the moon is generally a very bad thing. Yeah, guess what one of the plot lines of Symphogear G ends up being. And despite the girls putting up a valiant fight and achieving the first activation of their X-Drive powers, well, Fine ultimately does win. While the whole moon is not destroyed, Fine kills herself, tearing out just a chunk of it with assistance of Neshitan's power to disable the curse. The irony being that, well, Hibiki's words and actions do ultimately get through to her, convincing her to give up on her quest with her convictions, and allow humanity themselves to work to overcome the hindrance not just imposed by the curse, but their own differences as well. And with the girls having provided evidence that they can surpass things their own way, by giving birth to a power in the gear she created which she didn't even know was possible, she does decide to leave it up to them, her body crumbling to dust, and permitting the girls to have their final big damn hero moment of the season in thwarting the partial moonfall, seemingly at the cost of their own lives. But as I said, Symphogear is the anti-Madoka Magica, and while its endings often have a bittersweet tinge to them, they are never tragedies. And with the main heroine still around after it all ends, they were able to build out 4 more seasons of fun. Symphogear is really good, and while I jumped around all over the series, I tried not to get too spoilery on this as it is worth it to go out to see it for yourselves. And yet, as a consequence, this video went way longer than intended to, just because there's just so much here. As hell, there is a lot more I could talk about, such as the Senko trio of gear wielders and how Maria, Kirika, and Shirabe play excellently into the larger storyline the series develops in G onwards. But really, I think it's best to leave their stories alone for now, and to leave it as something fresh for those who go out to see it for themselves. All I'll say is they ended up adding a lot to the storyline, both with their use of the second season and beyond, to enhance the arcs of the original trio and Miku, while having their own arcs shine through. With each girl having a distinct persona of their own, you're going to find someone to like here. So if you're in any way interested in mecha, magical girls, lesbian romances, tasteful executions of fan service, and meaningfully developmental positive character arcs in a medium largely devoid of them for girls, then what more can we say than watch
自分の言葉で響に伝えたいことがあったんだ。私の伝えたいことミクと同じだったら嬉しいな。